John Douglas, by the way, is today's speaker. John is one of our main and most important staff members at the Center for Studies in Higher Education. He's a historian. He has written extensively on higher education issues, ranging from issues about the master plan in higher education to other types of issues. His most recent book is on nationalism and its effect on universities. And so I really want to welcome John to be with us today. John is going to talk about budgets, and he's going to talk about the how budgets are looking at the universities these days, particularly with perhaps emphasis on the University of California. So without further ado, let me turn it over to John Douglas.
Great, thanks so much, George. It's exciting to join you virtually. Those who are in the Bay Area, it's extremely windy. I don't know if it's like that down in LA too, but it's kind of a strange day out there. But tomorrow's a big, important day. We're all, I think most of us, or probably all of us, are excited about the transition, the smooth transition to power, if that's what it was. Smooth? Oh, maybe not. Welcome to the modern world. So I'm going to give a presentation. I'm going to set up my PowerPoint right now and see if this works. Can you see that? Oops, sorry, wait. Hold on, just a minute, I did something wrong. Share screen, there we are. Okay. All right. I had a problem with this last time. Oh, okay, there it looks like it's working. Can you, is my screen showing to everyone?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Okay, so, George asked me, and I think there was some interest, at least by Jazz and maybe somebody else, I'm not sure, in the Gardner seminar to kind of discuss budgets and University of California's budgeting, which then reflects on all kinds of issues like tuition and student loans and all of that kind of thing. So what I'm presenting here is I'm going to kind of go through elements of a report that I generated with Zach Bleemer on demand. I didn't just do it for the heck of it or because I was interested, but somebody asked that we produce this and through the Goldman School of Public Policy, with the idea that it might actually have some influence on policymaking. And I'll come back to that difficult road of doing anything like that. I kind of knew from the outset that the chances were low because I've spent a lot of time reading various reports over many decades and how they influence policy or not in a big state like California. But this is, most of my presentation is focused on this report that was done in 2018, so it's pre-COVID, and it's called Approaching a Tipping Point. I know some of you may have looked at it, you had a link. This was, the concept really was that the audience for this would be lawmakers who sometimes are a bit confused about the finances for UC and the challenges it faces, but also leadership and others, including regents in the University of California. And that was the main goal out of this, and we did get some funding for it from an unnamed donor that I won't name. So a few kind of introductory remarks. UC, is a very large public sector organization with substantial management autonomy, and I'm not going to get on all of that, but basically UC has a very unusual level of autonomy from state government. Technically, the legislature can't pass legislation and say, University of California must admit these people or have these courses or programs. They have largely a fiduciary link. So that means budgeting. That has an influence, obviously, on what you do internally, and you can have demands related to budget. But it's important to understand that UC has a significant amount of autonomy in its overall management. And that this is a multi-campus system, right? There are 10 campuses. This is if you're not aware, but most public institutions are in large-scale multi-campus systems. UC has some uniqueness to it. I have some comments in here sometimes because it's for a international audience. We don't have a Ministry of Education, for example, and all of that, but there are some real big differences in other parts of the world compared to what we have in California or in the US. We have growing demand for services, both research, teaching, or both all research, teaching, and learning, and public service. We have substantial mismatch of our social mandate with the resources, and how many students are we taking in, what can we perform with the money that we get. There's a real challenge for maintaining quality. And as I said before, the concept was that we would try to develop a report that kind of outlines, well, how do you address these issues, or what's the budgetary implications? And by doing it partly through an historical analysis of that's data driven. I want to note, sorry, that what I'm going to do is going to talk about this report, and then we'll make a little break and talk about Biden's plans for higher ed and the governor's recent budget. And George will join in with me, and I'm going to ask you a few questions at the end of the section about this report. And I'm hoping that we can have a little bit of an exchange about things like, should we have free tuition or not? Well, California is a growing population. Obviously, this is the larger, again, things that reflect the report's trying to at least, make sure that we understand this is part of the issues that we're dealing with. California is supposed to grow according to, this is now 2018. I didn't relook at the projections because they're redone by the Department of Finance. But we did have a projection of about 40 million in 2018, and that we reached 50 million by 2050. So that's a substantial growth in the number of people, which reflects again on how the University of California is supposed to serve the people of the state. There's a lot of news with COVID and other problems and economic decline that maybe that number will be changed. But I assume that there'll still be substantial population growth over, the next 30 years. I think that's still probably good. Then we have issues in the state related to, changing climate that is causing all kinds of financial impacts and economic and human toll that is also part of our modern world. California is, just to remind you, or if you didn't know, is the 7th largest economy in the world with a booming tech sector. So that's also an aspect that we kind of at least put into our calculations. We're also, and I know Saul's done a lot of work on this, but we have a low BA bachelor's degree and graduation degree production rates compared to our future labor needs. There's various studies and there are problems with these studies, but it does show that we definitely need more people with BAs. I think we can make that argument. Rising income inequality is also another major issue that we have in our state. And we have a high dependency on international talent, which was one of the factors that was very worrisome about the Trump administration, was the restrictions related to academic talent and otherwise H-1B visas and these kinds of things. California really needs, we don't produce enough talent at the doctoral level or engineers or these kinds of things to meet demand. Now there's a lot of nuance in that, absolutely, but we are heavily dependent on that. And then of course, since 2018, the issues related to COVID are really substantial, and we can maybe come back to that. But I am going to say that this part is really about what we did in this study and the things that we determined, looking at the history of the budgeting at UC and all that. Just a reminder for some of you that, the University of California is one part of a tripartite system of public institutions, which include the California State University, which is about twice the enrollment size as UC. But UC is at about 240,000, right? I'm already forgetting students. And we admit from the top 12.5%. For those who are native Californians, this undergraduate pool that we're supposed to draw students from. And there's the California Community Colleges, of course, which has a more of an open enrollment system. Then we have transfer policies, the most robust in the United States. It's historical. I think actually our numbers now at UC at the undergraduate level, I think we're closer to 28% of the students are transfer students, at least last year. At CSU, it's 40%. So that's really a remarkable part of the story of California. And then of course, there's the independents, and they are important, and they obviously are very important at the graduate level of Stanford and these high profile institutions, and they're very productive at but there's still a small percentage of people. And then we have the for-profit sector as well. So I just thought I would do that kind of general, what is the state of California? UC has 10 campuses. I have 280,000, sorry, I was off quite a bit there in the number of students, research intensive. Last time when I did this, we had about a $38 billion budget, but it depends on how you count things, and I'll come back to that. Generally in the report, we were only talking about kind of the core operating budget. So we don't include medical centers, which has this huge financial impact, and they kind of create noise when you're trying to analyze what the campuses are doing. Not that they're not important, they're really important, but they're really massive. And the other thing we don't count is like there's subsidies for the national labs. The University of California runs, they run 3 national labs. Los Alamos being the most famous, but there's one right up the hill at Berkeley as well. So we don't include those costs in most analysis about the operating budget. And that's another thing I'd like to say, just to kind of remind you, when you're generally talking about university budgets, you're talking about 2 categories of funding. One, although they're linked, one is operating budget. What does it cost to run the place? And then there's the capital or, physical side, maintenance, and along with new capital projects, sometimes funded by various sources, bonds from the state, bonds the university issues. So you have to kind of keep those separate to have a decent understanding of what's going on. So what were some of our findings? I'll just say that up front. The history of funding for UC is really a significant component to understanding its success as being, one of the top quality university systems in the world, to have campuses like UCLA and Berkeley and San Diego always ranked at the top tier in relationship to research output, for example. Well, a lot of that has to do with, there are a lot of different factors for it about California, but historically it also has to do with steady funding from the state of California, which is obviously part of the issues why we're writing this report, is because it's really become unstable in the last 2 decades plus, depending how you want to count it. But the real fundamental change that made that stability happen was this concept of workload funding. And California is an innovator in this. And in 1911, the budgets used to be based on very, like a percentage of the property tax that the state and local governments brought in. They didn't relate to the workload. And state and California, again, as we've seen this projection to 2050, if there's any one thing you need to remember about California, among many other things, is constant population growth. I mean, maybe we'll have a change in the next decade or something, or maybe now, but it'd be a temporary dip, or will it be permanent? But overall, historically, growth. So when you create a university system like the University of California, we started with Berkeley, then UCLA in 1919, and then on to these other campuses that are geographically dispersed. They're supposed to grow. They're supposed to take the top 12.5% of high school graduates, plus have all these other mandates, and you need to be able to grow. And that's another remarkable thing about UC, is its ability to grow with the state of California in terms of enrollment demand, but all the other kinds of things it does. And that all really, the magic of that related to this concept of workload funding, which actually was related to another period of reform on budgeting of schools, ADA, if you're familiar with that. That concept was brought in during the progressive era, and this is also a relationship to that. And so, but the trouble is, of course, that that's kind of dissipated significantly over time, and I'll give you some examples from the budget side. The declining state funding has just, really been significant over time. And I know George will, when we have some comments, George will comment on these things. And the question is, can it be reversed? Some people have always hoped that it could be reversed, that this decline in investment per student, for example, could be reversed, but it's highly unlikely. And it'd be partly because I think you just have so many more competing things for the state budgets these days than you did, say, 30 years ago, including pensions, which, are really a significant portion of cost now. Healthcare is, the highest cost in the world is in the United States for healthcare. We have some mandates related to funding K through 12 schools. So there's just a lot of, and then your higher ed is part of what we call the discretionary budget. So it's not mandated as to how much we get, even though we had these agreements about workload funding. It wasn't like a mandate for the budget. It was an understanding of how money would be generated and dispersed to UC. And so it sits in what they call the discretionary budget. And that discretionary budget, not pensions, not all these entitlements or bond paying off debt and all that, kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And I'm kind of losing track here because I haven't been looking at this for a while, but I think we're about at 8% or so of the entire state budget is discretionary. Well, maybe 40, 50 years ago, it was more like 20 or 25, something of that nature. So that you're getting close. So that gets back to, does the state have the capability without huge tax increases, major changes in reform, or just lots of different variables in order to reverse that trend? And I think, unfortunately, it's probably difficult to see that. There are other variables we'll get back to in the federal government and these kinds of things. But despite the state disinvestment, at least in the short term and up to 2018, before the COVID pandemic, I think we can make some arguments that UC did maintain access without getting additional state funding. Well, how did it do that? I'll come back to that. It's been a partial success. Well, I guess I'll say it right now. A partial success because an ability to diversified funding, the sources of funding that have come. And I think, up to 2018 and coming into the COVID era, we could say it's coping this far. But our question that we ask, and that's why we call it the tipping point, is there some point where the University of California just cannot continue to grow with the state's population and enrollment and services without a significant decline in quality and its overall productivity? And that's the question we raised I'll come back and send some budgetary options that we discuss related to that. So budgetary history, when you look at the budget of UC, it kind of tells you the history of the university in a certain way. As you can see, there's a lot of volatility that, not a lot, there's volatility that occurs over time, but generally a significant increase in the amount. This is the percentage of state funding to the university. So it doesn't tell you the entire funding, that different funding sources are coming in later. Early on, the university was almost completely dependent on state finances, like in the 1880s and 1890s, and going into the turn of the century. There were fees for students. There was not tuition, and this is this conceptual idea you have to keep in mind. Tuition being this really a concept that fees are paying for core institutional costs, like faculty salaries, like libraries, and these kinds of things. And fees tended to be for things like, well, eventually, for example, healthcare for students, or tutorial services, or in the early days, it related sometimes to the cost of materials that they needed to be an engineering student, for example. So you can see that fees do play a role here. And then there's this unusual kind of, and meanwhile, don't forget, growth. The number of students in 1900, I'm afraid I cannot remember what that number is, but it was really small compared to the 280,000 students or so that we have today. So you have to keep that in mind. But obviously, a very important event that relates to the university's finances and all universities in the United States is World War II and the plans for the GI Bill that came out to help bring back veterans so that they could enroll in the university in higher education in various forms. And that took the form of subsidies for tuition. So in other words, the University of California in this period actually secured these monies from the state, from the federal government when students applied. The money would technically go to the student, but it would eventually come to the university because the student could choose where they wanted to go. This is the system that the US has adopted since the 50s. There were some changes over time. It varies, the concept is the students get the financial aid and then they go to the institution of their choice, at least the federal aid. And so we see that this kind of in different world that emerges, there's also other kinds of funding coming from the federal government in that period. So, but to get up to the modern era, you see this kind of overall, this isn't all the funding sources, right? It's just the percentage. And you can see that in 1954 or so, almost 70% of this university's budget, again, the core budget, was from the state of California. It slowly declines, and there's various recessions and things going on that change those numbers over time. Now to kind of go into the more modern era and the story that you're probably all familiar with, and that is what happens when the state of California doesn't fund to the workload formula that it had promised, and it would work to so many students, full-time students, that would equate to X number of faculty positions, and they would give money, the state of California gives money to the University of California based on, I'm forgetting what level it is, an associate faculty person at X level, and there would be a negotiation about that, but I think I generally have that correct. And as that funding declined, the state didn't keep to its promise on workload funding for various reasons. As I said before, costs, recessions, political things going on. You see this need for the University of California in order to maintain access to increase tuition costs as one of the main levers to try to deal with the financial loss from the state of California. And you come to a really significant point when tuition, and I should say we didn't even use the word tuition until really the late 1990s. It was still, even when we really started doing tuition in the recession of about 92, the University of California still just called it fees because it was so reluctant, kind of backed into this policy as opposed to an overt plan to do it. It was kind of emergency financing. How could we get through this? And it kept developing, as in many other state public universities. But you see this major shift that occurs in about 2010, in which tuition income is larger than state income. So there's other ways to kind of look at this. As I said before, UC has also lost ground as a percentage of the state's general fund. This is just shows that like in 1987, UC got about 5.6% of that discretionary budget in that state general fund, and then it went down, well below. And there are other ways to look at it. Another is to look at gross state product and how much it's gone down over time, even though the state of California's overall economy has grown. Again, the money being generated and going into to state coffers has been diverted to other kinds of things. And you see also, just as a reminder, in the discretionary budget has had to fight for funds, or its competitor, one of its major competitors are prisons. And which also has had a very strong prison guard union, which has really laid significant political victories in gaining funding and sources. And of course, the United States being one of the nations with the highest incarceration rates, that also plays into that story. It's just a tragedy. But anyway, so then the other part of that story, as I said before, is that capital funding, which is really an important component. At one time, the state actually funded the construction of housing, for example, dorms and these kinds of things. And that's all dissipated over time. And in fact, another part of this storyline is that during the governorship of the second Mr. Brown, he made another shift in policy that's had a huge effect. And that is, before you would really have a separate budget for capital, the state would put up so many bonds, and we haven't had a general obligation bond since 2006, I think, for higher ed, which is really very problematic, especially when you look at a place like Berkeley or UCLA. The more recent campuses, maybe a little less, but the older campuses have infrastructure issues, including seismic retrofitting that is just a huge cost. Actually, if you want to know, some of the worst buildings built were in the 60s, and many of those cost a lot of money to retrofit. So those costs are there. But one of the things that Brown did was he said, hey, I know a way we can kind of, manage further cuts to UC. We're not going to really look to provide substantial additional bond funding or other sources for capital construction. And we're going to ask the University of California to start doing it on its own and to incorporate some of those bond costs into their operating budget. So that's an interesting kind of accounting move, but it's had another significant impact on the amount of money that's available for faculty salaries, for enrollment, for other kinds of things that the university does. Again, how has UC coped with this? I kind of said that at the beginning. The big part is diversity. It's diversified its portfolio, and I'll show you how. But one of the big areas, of course, is increasing tuition. But there's been a significant caveat that many people don't really understand, particularly students, but also the general public, is that the University of California, from really the early beginnings of the development of a tuition policy in the 1990s, and other public universities have done this, but UC's been particularly, I think, aggressive or thought ahead about this, was to take 33% of any additional dollars that they got in tuition and put it back into financial aid. This is really so this concept is that actually raising tuition is a certain form of progressive taxation, in that you're taking money from those who have more wealth and then redistributing it to lower income students. And that lower income students tends to be identified or correlates heavily with Pell Grant students. So students are getting Pell Grant students grants, and then they're getting university funding as well. The net effect is that around 50% of all students at a place like Berkeley, I think throughout the entire system actually, pay no tuition. Right, so this is an issue that gets kind of confused, but the university is diverting significant resources. I think if I come back later, Zach and I tried to figure this out. It wasn't easy to find this out with trying to get data from the office of the president. But I think we're talking about $750 or $800 million in 2018 of tuition money going back to financial aid. Now, let me say, there's still huge problems, right? Because the other cost that's greater than tuition in most of the campus settings, maybe not Merced, I'm not sure, is the cost of housing and other kinds of things that you have to do to live. And that, our model generally, the University of California, is that students are leaving the home and they're not at commuter schools. So there's these costs that relate to that. And those are really substantial. And that's why you still see, a fair amount of, other kinds of loans and other kinds of grants being given out. But I just wanted to note that this is a variable. We're giving back 33% to these students based on also kind of a structural understanding of tuition costs. In other words, Pell Grants are only $6,000 right now, right? But if Biden does actually go through his policies of doubling Pell, that might change. That would have potentially some benefit for UC to reconsider how it distributes financial aid. And that's another thing in the modern era. 40 years ago, the University of California was not a significant provider of financial aid. Now, because of this program, but also raising money for scholarships, it is a substantial portion provider of financial aid. And that's also a new world of public university financing that didn't exist not that long ago. So another area, I wanted to at least show you the net cost to Californians. If you took everybody together, if you took everybody, ignore the chart on the left, that's the same chart, just to show you tuition coming up. But if you look at where the actual full cost of tuition is for the average student in California, you can see that their contribution to the educational cost is rather small, relatively speaking. Now, if you look at international students or out-of-state students, you can see that huge difference in the net cost of those students directly. And that's, again, one of the variables that the university pursued, was to bring in international students with some controversy, absolutely, about capacity. Are we displacing Californians? And that's another thing to note. Unlike a Stanford or a Dartmouth or other private institutions, the University of California and most public universities, with a few exceptions, have a strong mandate to serve this population in their state. And I'm not a little behind the data, but it used to be around 92% of all students went to college in some form in their own state. So there's still a really strong relationship. We read about the Harvards and all that, but this is really a small percentage of actually the number of people out there going to college at all. So another area the university has been successful is to raise federal research funds. And this means UC is still highly competitive to bring those funds, even if state funds have gone down and other issues like rising student factor ratios have occurred. We've also brought in more money through educational and auxiliary services income. What does that mean? Well, one is we have over 450,000 or something students in extension courses that raises money. There are costs to, we bring in money by charging for dorms or food services. That's auxiliary services, but also there's auxiliary enterprises, and that includes things like we do bring in money, although it doesn't always pay for the cost of of the lawyers for intellectual property, patents, licenses, and these kinds of things. And that has also increased substantially. And then we have increased philanthropy. That means people giving money to the university. But as George knows, is that people don't give money just for general operating costs. They must always give money for very specific things they want. And yes, that can be a chair in a department, but it could be, a lot of money goes to athletic departments. And guess what? It goes just to the athletic department. There is overhead costs and things going on. But generally, it's not a great source for general operating costs. They're very specific needs. But then nonetheless, very important component and growing in importance. It'll never be like, the kind of story like at a place like Harvard where 35 or something % of their operating budget is, generated through philanthropy from their amassed guilty, when you're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars, not just a couple billion, but 40 billion, you kind of wonder about Harvard. But in any case, is it a nonprofit? Oh, we won't go down that road. But anyway, increased philanthropy. So here it gives you a little, again, to get the sense of what's happened in terms of the diversity and size and scale of the budget. So in 2000, we had 183,000 students and we brought in $19 billion for the operating budget. Again, I'm not counting medical centers, national labs. I think there might be a couple other things there that Zach and I, said, well, that creates noise and understanding what's going on at the campus level. In terms of, our main mandate related to enrollment and these kinds of things. But you can see these changes in the percentages and the increase in tuition and fees that have come in. And again, a substantial amount of that increase of the increase from previous relates to bringing in international and out-of-state students who pay a much higher premium. We've all worried about the market for that. If we're charging the same amount for a student from Hong Kong to come to Berkeley as what Stanford charges, which we're getting into, I'm again a little bit behind the curve, $38,000 for tuition alone, not the housing and all that, or maybe 40K. It's a lot of money coming to us, but there are some issues related to it. But it's been that plus the increase. The increase in actual undergraduate fees hasn't really significantly added to the financial picture in terms of the benefit for the university directly operating budget. It has because 33% of it, of the regular admissions, and I'm sorry, I should say also international students, is going back to financial aid. So it's a benefit, obviously, but not necessarily significant for the core operating budget. The other part of that story I should note is real huge increases in, not huge, but large increases in professional degree programs. We've grown our professional degree programs, MAs, certificates, these kinds of things, and they have a premium cost to them that has also been a significant component. And this is also a story you see in other parts of the world. Okay, why is it doing that? Okay, so negatives, what's happened in part of this financial world? Over the last decade plus, depending on the variants and things that have gone on, we've had, particularly after the 2008 global recession, there were significant cuts that had to be made. And where do you make cuts? Well, if your budget, your operating budget is, let's say, about 80% of your cost is labor, faculty, staff, everything, we're highly labor-intensive industry thus far for the foreseeable future, but this is going to change some. The only way you can really cut costs is dealing with your labor costs. So we've had staff layoffs, faculty hiring freezes for periods, declines in competitive faculty salaries, which have been a significant concern for those managing the university and the academic senate. We've had larger classes because we have fewer faculty. Yet we keep, don't forget, the other storyline is we keep taking on more students, right? The university made that decision. We're going to continue to meet our mandate to some reasonable degree of students coming to us in a growing population of high school students. And we're just going to try to figure out how to absorb that cost with the hope that some way we can financially figure this out later in some way. But you still have these costs. Higher student to faculty ratios, already said that. Higher workload student credit hours. The reason I say that is because a lot of lawmakers, they go, well, these guys aren't teaching enough. You should have that history faculty person teach 8 courses instead of 5 in a year or 4. And if you look at engineering, which is a different environment, yes, they teach, but they also have labs and other students and these kinds of things are a little different than the social sciences. They might teach 2 courses in a year or what. But the thing that's better to look at not is how many courses the students are teaching, the faculty are teaching, but how many credit hours, how many students are they actually teaching overall? And that's the student credit hours. And then you see these really significant increases in the amount of how many students a faculty person is managing. That's one way of putting it. So, it's still a little hard to understand the impact. We tried to look at this and say, well, what was the impact of these, qualitative markers or measurements that we can make that relate to what we think is the quality of the institution. And I think it's still, at that time in 2018, we said, well, it's kind of a mixed story because yes, there's significant impacts going on, but there are also some positives that the university seems to have done, even in the midst of this financial difficulty. We've captured a higher percentage of federal research grants. So in other words, we're still recruiting and we still have really good faculty who could, and graduate students and postdocs that can generate funding. So in this time period, over the last decade or so, the university, and with all this financial difficulties after the Great Recession, we're still bringing in more and more federal money. We're extremely competitive. And federal money that comes in for research has indirect costs, and we charge X amount. For a federal grant from the NSF, for example, the university takes in about 55%, takes that for costs of running the labs, running the electricity, maintenance of buildings, these kinds of things. There's some questionable things in there, I think, but there's been some scandals in the past in some institutions. Stanford, specifically, a major scandal. And but this conceptual idea is that you don't just take grants on. There's a lot of costs related to it, and they have to be reflected in the grants. That money comes in and helps subsidize the institution to some degree. Not necessarily classrooms, but other kinds of costs. So, and at the same time, while we're, is our quality declining? Well, maybe students won't be applying. If there's the quality is declining, they'll go to Arizona State, or they'll go to Oregon, or these kinds of things, or they'll go to, small liberal arts colleges anyway. But the concept is we look at the numbers and we say, oh my, there's still this increase in applications. Students aren't going away. And at the same time, with much pressure from the state, and deservedly so, we've also gone up in our graduation rates. We've shrunk that, we've reduced the time that students come to the university and get out. And I should note that, that's generally thought to as a 6-year period because a lot of students come from lower income backgrounds and all these kinds of things. And again, UC ranks among the best in the world. So, we're still having some good indicators that where our quality is not declined, even with these significant declines in state funding. So this just shows you some of the data that we generated to look at the issues that I noted, staff to student to faculty ratios going up. And I think this is a real big concern. And I think George would agree with me. We're really at the outer stretches of most public universities, let alone the privates, as to what we have in terms of ladder rank faculty. These are faculty that are tenured versus, we do have other faculty, including when I say student to all faculty relate to lecturers and other kinds of people who teach around, I think if I remember, about 34%, 30% of the courses that are taught now. It may have gone up, I don't know, it's hard to tell. That's another variable in this. But in terms of ladder rank, we're really at the upper stretches. Just to give you a concept, the difference in resources. So the University of California is getting, close to, 25, 26%, I mean, 25, 26 students to faculty. At a place like Harvard, it's 10 to 1, or it's 8 to 1. I think at Stanford, it might be 8 to 1. It just tells you the huge resource differences that we face as a, top tier research intensive university. Again, this just shows the data showing that we've had increased application pool, or it's steady. It hasn't really gone down. 6-year graduation rate, we tend to use that than a 4, because again, a lot of students don't complete in 4 years. We'd like to reduce that. I think at Berkeley right now, we're about 92% of students graduate in 6 years or less, which again is as good as many of the elite privates. It's really and knowing that our population of students is very different. I didn't say this, I meant to earlier on, but because of our financial aid and because of our admissions policies and all the complexities related to that, we have more low-income students now than we did at the opening of the recession. And we have among the highest Pell Grant students of percentage within the system. Each of the campuses, there's variance there, but we're at about, I think, 38% or so are Pell Grant throughout the system. So we service many more low-income students than the elite privates, or many of the elite publics as well. So we have a very different student population from a Harvard, and that reflects in the graduation rate. But overall, students make it through, which is also a fantastic. So we've actually increased graduation rates. We have worried about course sequences and these kinds of things. Okay, I'm almost getting through this so that we can go to some discussion. But so interim success in coping with large state disinvestment. UC argues that we need to have a state income that would be a bump of about 30% per student funding. That was the argument around then in 2018. And there are a lot of indicators that we're doing fairly well. But this also kind of brings up a conundrum. The state keeps giving us less and less money, yet we've managed it because we've had efforts to diversify our funding pool. We still maintained our admissions policies. We have some markers of actual quality increase. Okay, it's come at the cost of student to faculty ratios. Do lawmakers care about that? Do they care about small classes? That's a hard argument. The people think they do. At least we know that rich people think it's important. They send their children many times to institutions with very low student to faculty ratios, but it's a hard qualitative, it's hard to put that into numbers or ways to persuade state lawmakers is a good idea. So, why not? Lawmakers might say, hey, well, you're doing really well with less. Maybe we'll even give you less so you can do more. So there's a kind of, your success story is also a difficult, doesn't help you politically, right, necessarily, in trying to get the state to give you more money. And I think the state should. I think most people think they should. But I get back to there are significant constraints and competitors for that state dollars. So what we did was we said, there's certain issues that are coming up to the University of California. Can we continue to take on more students without a substantial revision or enhancement of our funding model? And that's the question we asked. Are there alternative pathways to a new funding model? And so we've kind of categorized them like this. Said, okay, here's some of these big picture options. And there are many people who keep arguing, and understandably, that the state should step up and provide, that 30%, I don't know where we are now with the budget changes going on now, but in 2018, it was like we were still about 30% lower in the amount we got per student than we did in like 2000 or something like that. Not that long ago, right? And then this erosion's been going on a long time. So the question is, hey, can we get the state to, face up and figure out a way, there have been proposals, for example, for a specific tax that could be passed as a constitutional amendment. So the university is like an entitlement. There's been other kinds of things like that, like let's create some gigantic endowment that's a little bit like the state of Texas has for the University of Texas through oil revenues. But I think, unless I'll ask George whether he thinks about this later, but it seems unlikely, that we're going to find a substantial boost. We could get some boosts when the economy does better, depending on the governor, depending on the lawmakers, depending on whether there's some containment of healthcare costs, other kinds of issues that maybe we can get a bump, but it's probably not going to be substantial. So even though there are some people who did argue in 2018 that this was the only answer we really had. But what do we do if there is only steady state funding, that 30% is never made up, or we have other kinds of issues going on? Should we ask this question, should we seek stabilization and just say, okay, you know what, we can't take on, we'll still grow, but not at the level that we promised in the California master plan. Something's going to give at some point. We just can't keep down this road of increased student to faculty ratios, other kinds of financial issues that make it hard for the institution to be one of the top institutions in the world in terms of quality of its teaching and other and public service and research. So another alternative path in the big picture kind of options, then I'm going to get into the smaller ones, is that we should grow an online degree programs. Now, this is pre-COVID, and we were arguing this. There are real problems with the state of Arizona State's programs, and it's kind of glossed over as to what's happening there when they have over 100,000 students, online students who are separate from the campus, the main campus itself, which I think is about 40,000 students. And but we argued, university really should try to think about this as an alternative path, in addition to what it's doing in terms of providing access, with the concept that it could be of lower cost with lots of problems, lots of issues, like, are we going to create two different classes of UC students? Will they be significantly different in their demographic makeup, racial, ethnic, economic? But we do think that we did think at that time the university should explore this more carefully. Again, that it had before, and there are various issues that happened. I think Robert was on the list here, Robert May in the Senate, and he has strong opinions about this as well. But I do think that we should be, with COVID, perhaps this is something that we can think about more coherently if we're going to maintain access with less and less funding from other sources, although there's some changes coming up that might be a ray of hope. So what could we do? What are the things? Well, our concept was there's no silver bullet. What are the series of things that we might do in order to, enhance or change the funding model? And these are not, okay, this is a policy document, right? Our objective is to say things, and I think that was one of the advantages of us doing this as opposed to an official report by the Office of the President, which this was not. This was an independent group doing this, was that we could say some things that they would never say. And that we're like, when we're doing a policy paper, we're doing options, right? We'll say, here's the options, pluses, minus. These are ways to think about it. So I'm not advocating these, right? I'm just looking at the variables that the UC might find. So obviously tuition and fees are really significant. So might UC try to increase tuition and financial aid because we still have that designation of that. And this is an issue that just is, I think, is a very much problematic and a challenge for the leadership of the University of California. They can complain, but it's hard to complain a lot. And that is, every time we get a budget deal from a governor, they then say you have to keep tuition flat. Okay, we can make an argument that that maybe, we need to constrain tuition. It shouldn't grow too fast, or that it should be at least inflation, but flat. So during Governor Brown's era, we had a 5-year moratorium on tuition increases at the undergraduate level. There's a whole different world going on with professional degrees and other things of that nature. And that was a killer because, if we just said at least inflation, it would have been, it hurts a lot of students. It would add up to a fair amount of money that could go towards faculty hiring, student faculty ratios, classrooms, all those kinds of things that we think of as core expenses. We also, I won't get into this, but put out a conceptual idea of redoing tuition so that we can think, we understand what's the, no, let me say it a different way. Students in the United States live in a world in which they see a price, a sticker price, and then later they find out how to deal with discounts that they get. Discounts being in the form of, or I should say subsidies and discounts, but subsidies from the federal government in the form of Pell Grants or loans, from the state of California under Cal Grants, which are very generous, which is also an important part of that fee structure. I didn't mention that before, but that's been a benefit for the University of California. Additional Cal Grants that help students afford going to UC. And so they have to back in. Now, a lot of students can navigate that, but a lot of students from lower income groups can't. So the argument was, why don't we kind of have a very good sense of whether a student is eligible for Pell Grants or not. UC does a great job of making sure students get those grants. That's another operational cost, but it's well worth it, right? So there's a lot of machinery to help students get the financial aid they need from outside the university and inside the university. But if we structured it, we know what that students, if they're already Pell Grant eligible, we can easily calculate that normally. We could project that and instead give a tiered pricing structure. If you're of this family income, you pay this. If you have this income, you're this. And they know that if you're making less than $75,000 or $60,000 from a family of four, you could probably, you can guess what the Pell Grant amount would be or other sources. So that concept was a little abstract, but the concept is to say up front, what's the cost to you, as opposed to after you navigate all of this different financial aid. I went down that road a little too far, but it's a really good idea, except for everybody tells me it's politically impossible. And that's an issue often, that the leadership goes, we can't do that politically, so we can't figure out new ways of doing things. Another area, I'm not advocating this, but it relates to an overall trend and discussion over the last 3 decades about financing of higher ed in public universities, is to charge different costs per field, so that you're charging more for example, engineering, based on what? Yes, partly the cost of educating them in that field, but also their potential future income. There's this whole argument about that. Again, this is just a variable. Another is to charge different fees by campus. I've always in the past been against that. Now I don't know, because I think there are ways that you could do that. Obviously, the concept is that there's a higher premium that people want to go to Berkeley than they want to go to, say, Merced at this time. The world will change, who knows? It's really problematic. But one of the things you could do is you could create a subsidy out of that. In other words, if Berkeley charges X amount, well, 20% of that goes back to the general pool or goes to specific other campuses that charge, the normal amount. Right? So there are structural ways you could do that. But believe you me, this is another area, a hot button issue that gets people very upset, and understandably. Another one is to, I already said that, the new pricing model, tier tuition rates. And then the other one is, well, if there are other sources of funding coming in, for example, if Pell Grants go up to $12,000 under Biden, maybe UC should rethink at the amount, the 33% that we're redirecting to financial aid. How does that relate to the actual needs of the students coming in and their financial packages? I don't know the answer to that, but 33% is a very high percentage. What if it was 28? What if it was 26? And then targeted financial aid, and we argued it would targeted philanthropy for certain for low-income students. Anyway, these are the kinds of things that we're trying to kind of suggest without significant amounts of research, to say, these are the kind of variables you need to think about: regents, president, chancellors, deans. The other is, although I think it's a very difficult one, is to revise non-residential international enrollment targets. So for a period, UC and Berkeley and went really after this, and we were at about 18%, I believe, in undergraduate enrollment. UC and Berkeley announced it was going to go to 20%. And then there was basically a deal in Sacramento that said, no, don't do that. Don't target, you're pushing out Californians. And we don't like the way it looks and these kinds of things. Even if I could make the argument that if there's capacity, enrollment capacity, bringing more international students will actually subsidize and bring in more Californians. That's what UC's argued over time. As to whether it's actually true, it's a little hard to tell. But you could, I think, relook at that and really, project out. Now, the market for international students has changed since 2018. There's still a lot of demand at places like Berkeley from international students and students from China, but they've had all these visa policies and Trump world. So there are a lot of interesting variables that relate to that. Further grow professional degree programs if there's a market. I don't know if we've gotten to saturation on that. I think some people worry that we have, but and that we charge so much. But thus far, everywhere we look, we see that graduate education is a growth market. And in fact, in the recession, in the COVID pandemic era, undergraduate enrollment dropped at one point about 4 or 5% overall, significantly higher. I think it was 18 or 20% nationally at the international for international students. But guess where it grew? It grew at the graduate level. So this tells you something about the pandemic and how people in certain kinds of programs. It's not doctoral programs; they're professional degree programs. But expand extension and concurrent enrollment. We already do a lot there, but maybe there's some room for more. I think one of our issues that UC has been very, very conservative about how degrees are given out. We'll get into all of that, but there are some issues that could be brought where there are some mini degree programs or other things that concurrent extension could do. Another issue at the federal level, which will probably go nowhere, is that the era of 55% on the indirect costs at the federal level for grants, research grants, that world's changed. That concept, why we charge 55 and Stanford is something like 70%, is because the concept was the federal government said, well, you're getting subsidized by the state, so we don't give you as much we don't let you get as much as indirect costs. So that's an area that maybe the Biden administration might be interested in, although I think they've got other fish to fry. But that would be a variable, right? Increase indirect cost rates by 5% or something like that. Increase patents and license income. Well, the university is always trying to do that. I tried to find out a little bit, but I have no idea. What is CRISPR going to do for Berkeley? I don't know. It's potential that it could bring in money because the concept under the Bayh-Dole Act is that the University of California has a stake in the patents and licenses that are generated by CRISPR. There's a lot of legal stuff going on, but the concept generally is it's a third for the inventor. Never mind what she does in applications with various enterprises that she's launching, Jennifer Doudna, or a third goes to the university and a third goes to the department. So, but this is an area which universities are always dreaming for a home run, like Gatorade, which is the biggest still, I think it's still the biggest generator of money for the University of Florida, electrolytes. Fundraising and endowments. Okay, let's see, I'm looking at the time. Of course, there's management efficiencies. How can we do more with less? But we have really cut a lot already in terms of staffing and administrative support over the last 2 decades and accelerated after the Great Recession. So we're still worrying about that. Academic efficiencies. Okay, maybe we could imagine a world with higher student faculty ratios, larger classes. We could try to figure out ways in which students could get through the system faster, like having a 3-year bachelor's degree. All kinds of issues related to this about what we're doing, the quality, who has control. These are just variables for you to kind of contemplate. So basically, we went through all this and, we basically said that, the university has done an amazing job, really, in diversifying funding sources, as I've outlined. It has a lot of questions, though, in confronting it in the future. We're going through a period where high school graduate numbers are leveling off, but a slight increase COVID's strange. We'll see there might be attrition rates in high school. And the projection is a slow increase and then more of an increase over time in the number of high school graduates. That's always crystal ball stuff, but generally California keeps growing, and I think it probably will. Things will happen, but our question is, does the university has to confront this issue at some point? Can you just continue to grow without additional resources? How much organizational change can you do to be the new university and the new funding model? And we've just laid that out. But at some point, you've got to make a decision about it, is what we were trying to say to the leadership pre-COVID. So, sorry I went on a long time. What I thought I could do is ask, are there a few questions related to what I presented? And then I'd like to kind of fast forward and we could have more of a discussion. I know that you want to have a break at some point, right, George? But a little bit of discussion about the Biden higher ed plan, and then a little bit about what the state of California's Governor Newsom just came out with a revised budget with money for higher ed. So, but first I thought I could take a few questions. Is that okay, George?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, and then we'll have a little more of a discussion. But one thing I will note too is that Jazz brought up an issue that I didn't think about, although I should have known better, and that was this other area of diversifying resources, and that is, having these fees that students are paying on their own volition by voting for various enhanced services and programs. So it's not gigantic, but it's another part of that story of increased ways of taxing people in order to pay for other things.
So I see that Derek and Gordon have their hands up. So Derek, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Thank you so much for this. First of all, this is super helpful in thinking about financing higher education, and the historical context is really valuable. But you mentioned, thinking about where we're at currently, I think the tiered tuition system by income seems to me to be the most efficient way forward. And you mentioned that is politically impossible. So I was curious if you could describe, in your estimation, what are the most valid political arguments against that? And is it insurmountable? And maybe it's impossible in the short run, but maybe in the medium run, it's something that can actually gain some steam.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to overly state that it was politically impossible. I just got some feedback from friends in the office of the president. One, I asked because it's very theoretical. It's not a well laid out plan. It doesn't do all the calculations or have any kinds of you need to consult with financial aid people. It's a complex world, this whole financial aid and funding and all of that. But what I was told basically was that, it's probably, we could do it, but the political side of it is just convincing our constituents, lawmakers, and the regents that we should go down this path wasn't of interest. But it's partly because the other thing on the table that I didn't mention that is in discussion at the regents is to basically, freeze tuition. In other words, once you enter the University of California, and I believe this goes to the graduate level, but at the undergraduate specifically, you wouldn't ever change, they wouldn't change that number. They wouldn't adjust for inflation or any of that. And you would have a stable price, because that's one of the big issues for families is the unpredictability of what's going on with tuition. And a big example of that is that, there was a period after the Great Recession where the university didn't even know its budget from the state until halfway through the fiscal year. And so there's all this kind of crazy stuff going on, a lot of instability. And there has been research that shows that if you have some stability, you can see that families can understand what it costs and it's not going to change on them. So that seems to be a higher political priority. So what I've outlined, and there's a paper or two I wrote, which is a little bit more, a blog, I think it was, that's a little more detailed on it. It's not a fully vetted concept, but I do think it is. We have a pretty good sense of what it costs, what students are eligible for, what financial aid through Pell Grants, very specific data that you can do that, and Cal Grants, and then also University of California financing. So you structure that as the base, and then you figure out what the additional cost or not cost is. I think it's a model you could do, but no university in the United States does it like that. None of them. Our system is all based on what is basically, the model that came out of the 1950s, and that was in the GI Bill, is that the students have the money, then they come, and I didn't say that quite right, but it's basically a system that doesn't show upfront costs clearly.
Actually, John, there are a few cohort-based systems in the U.S.
Oh, really?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, go ahead. Tell which ones are they?
I don't remember offhand. We did look at them a couple of years ago. Several systems have gone to cohorts and then backed away from them, but I think there's still a few that are going. So it isn't something that's never been done. It has been done, but it hasn't been regarded as a great success. And one of the biggest concerns is that if there's a huge budget cut, and if there's a need to raise tuition significantly, then in a cohort system, if you stick to it, you're really sticking it to the new students relative to the old students.
Yeah, there's a lot of politics. I stand corrected then on that. I just didn't find any, but there's a lot of politics related to tuition. I'll give you another example. Was this concept that raising tuition is a bargaining tool when you're going and talking to the governor about the budget. So in other words, like if you don't have it all set out in a policy that's, let's say, coherent and stable, because it's so volatile dealing with the state year to year in the budget, you go in with the tuition rate being a negotiating point. It doesn't serve the student well, or the university to a certain extent, but it's the reality of what's going on. In the old days, there was a much stronger legislative role in budgeting for higher ed, and it was more formulaic, in fact. But now, really, what you're talking about is a budget negotiation with the governor.
Yeah, I think that's true. So, Gordon, you have a question?
Yeah, so I have two questions. One is related to the discussion around how the state is disinvesting in the UC as the UC continues to grow. And so I'm just interested in if there's a number or a value or like a ballpark range of how much more funding is required per percentage of growth that the UC continues to move forward. And then, so that's kind of like one question. And then my other one is related to how the UC attempts to cope with declining state investment. I wonder if you could just speak more to explaining the difference between departmental and college difference with respect to increasing in federal research funding. Because when I think about which departments bring in the most funding, and I'm just interested in how that relates to some of the conversations you may have had around how the UC uses that to cope with state disinvestment.
Yeah, well, I'll answer a little bit of the first thing. I'm going to look to George because he knows this stuff better than I do about the internal distribution of indirect funds. But so I'm afraid I don't have that number on me right now. It is something in the ballpark of 33 or 30% per student more than we're getting now in state funding. I think that's the number UC has used. Unfortunately, I actually not really engaged in budget stuff too much these days. This program was done in 2018, so I don't know that exact number, but George might, and I think George can also answer the question more better to you related to, well, where does that indirect funds go that let's say the engineering department or physics are bringing in from various grant sources? George?
Okay, sure. So to the first question, I think the 30% number was really the number that UC needs in order to bring us back to where we were before the Great Recession. So I think that's the baseline. I mean, if you choose other baselines, you can get different numbers. For example, one baseline that I've always liked to use is 1990, because I did the calculation once that if we actually got state funding per student today that was the same as what we were getting in 1990, of course, appropriately adjusted for inflation, then we would have to charge no tuition. So that's a measure of how much degradation there has been in state funding since 1990. And in fairness, I have to say 1990 was my choice of year because it was an unusual year. It followed 8 years of Governor Ronald Reagan, 8 years of Jerry Brown 1.0. And so the university was in somewhat bad shape when George Deukmejian became governor. And Deukmejian, in his first year as governor, increased UC's budget by something like 30%. So that's a great baseline to work off of. But still, it is significant. So the answer to your question was that 30% number that John quoted, I think is related to the Great Recession. The second question you had to do with overhead. And where does it go and how is it distributed? And that is actually a very complicated question because overhead is treated a lot like income for the mafia. The University of California charges something on the order of 50 to 55% overhead on federal research grants. Depends on the campus, the exact number. And when it comes in, the state of California, the general fund, takes off the top a certain percentage of that money that goes directly into the state general funds. And then of the money that's left over, it goes to the office of the president, and the office of the president takes some of that money and then sends it back to the campus which generated it. And when it gets to the chancellor's office, the chancellor will take a certain percentage off the top to keep for various purposes, and then send the money down to the dean. And then the dean will take some money off the top and send the rest back down to the department to spend as they wish. By the time it gets back to the department, we're talking about maybe 10% of the entire amount of overhead. So the bottom line is that when a department, say, computer engineering, making this up, if computer engineering generates a lot of overhead money, yes, computer engineering will get some of that back and will go into their funding. But a lot of the rest goes to other places and generally benefits the university. So that some of the money that computer engineering generates will go to the humanities, for example, through the chancellor's office or the vice chancellor of research's cut of the money. So then that money does get distributed around the campus. Does that answer your question?
See, it's pretty complicated, this budget stuff. It goes all over the place, and the deals are made over time. I'll only note related to this is that, you think, oh, this is a coherent system. Somebody sat down and said, okay, how are we going to do this? No, that's not completely true. It's a little bit true, but it's an accumulation of over time of decisions that are made. And sometimes they're still kind of made sense or not. A great one I think that's really important is what overhead should the Berkeley campus take of professional degree tuition that is being brought in and has rose over time. At one point, the University of California had uniformity in all graduate degree tuition rates. And then with the financial issues and other campuses like University of Virginia doing various things to create different kind of funding sources, what they call cost centers, they're profit and loss centers. Certain departments are loss centers, some are bringing in money. Well, law school, for example, that's not a good one right now, but early on, that was one of the ones. They wanted to charge a lot more tuition. And at Berkeley, they wanted to charge more tuition in part because that's what everybody else is doing, and there's a prestige aspect to it. But more relevant to it was they needed money also to redo the building that if you've walked up there and see that new portion of the law school. They also wanted some of that cut of increased tuition over time for that, and then in that as well, there were negotiations with business schools and law schools. Well, what percentage of that money should go back to the general fund to the campus, not to the campus fund? And so decisions were made kind of like, okay, we'll broker this deal. Oh, the Virginia's doing this. Let's do this here at Berkeley. Anyway, I overdid this, but it's structurally gets very complicated.
George, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm interested, John, revisiting this paper after 2 years. I wonder, especially in relation to the conclusions of the paper and the various options and paths you identify, how your thinking may have changed, if at all, over the 2 years since you read this marvelous piece.
Well, I think a big variable is, well, what will be the demand? And this is right up your alley, Sal. And that is, well, what will be the demand out of California high schools? How many high school graduates are we going to have over the next 10 years? It's a huge variable as to what our workload is, and can we maintain our social mandate? So if California is losing lots of people and people aren't having kids, then that's a big variable. And maybe, you know, the question I asked that I kind of still culturally looking historically, I'm always thinking California is growing, 2% a year in population growth that is mirrored in some way in high school graduates. And that's the thing to remember, our mandate, I know Saul knows this, but our mandate is to take the top 12.5%, however we define it, of high school graduates, not just the general population, and of that pool, what kind of students do we get out of that? But so I think that would be the big one is variation. But if I looked at the listing of variables, I think all of them are remain relevant. I don't think we'll get a big state chunk, although I would want to come back a little bit related to the financial aid we may get from the federal government as a variable. I know it's not a game changer, but it is different than what we faced a year ago. So population increase definitely, and what are the demographic projections? But otherwise, I feel pretty good about most of the variables we went through. But I would also be interested in your opinion.
Well, I'm not prepared to offer mine. I wanted to also raise the question for George, how your thinking may have changed over the last 2 years.
Well, it's interesting. I think what's changed for me over the last couple of years has been just a better understanding of the need to relate enrollment issues to budget issues. The University of California, in my view, has not stuck to its guns in terms of trying to maintain funding per student at the university. And there have been several times over the last few years in which the state has mandated for the university to take an increase in enrollment without providing the funds for those students. And I think that that's a huge mistake. And I would certainly advocate for the university taking a very strong stand that the university would not consider increased enrollments unless additional funding comes from the state to pay for those students. So that to me is a big one. A second big one is going to be the role that COVID has played, in particular, the role that online education will play. I am extremely impressed that universities around the country essentially switched overnight to online teaching. I would never have thought that the universities could do that so adeptly. But now that people are much more used to online, it's clear that online will be a much more reasonable thing to do going forward, not for whole curricula, but as supplements to curricula. And I think that's going to change things, and it may change the way that there's a perception of the economics of higher education as well. So I think that's going to play a big role as well.
I will say that we did mention that in the report, and we'll try to push a little bit on that. Also, that UC has been so conservative for reasons that we can understand in going to the online world. So maybe we've accelerated here, but University of California is very conservative in certain ways. It has served it well, but it needs to innovate more.
Thank you.
So let me suggest that we take a 10-minute break and then come back, and then we can talk a little bit more about what's been happening recently in the post-COVID world. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, I have a kind of a couple of questions for people that relates to the Biden plan, and then we'll talk a little about the governor's budget as well, George. So that's great.
Sounds good. So 10 minutes from now, I currently show it as 12:23. So why don't we come back at 12:33?
Okay.
Well, John, as you can see, I've got my power back. Power to the people.
From the wind, you think, or what was the
Yeah,
cause?
third was the wind.
Yeah. Oops. Okay. So I just saw Jazz's note about cohort tuition rates, and I just quickly looked at North Carolina. They count cohort as simply what I said before was the you pay this is the fee once you arrive. It won't change until you graduate. So it's not the same as income-based cohort. So in any case, at least I looked at that one, but there may be others that's ignorance is bliss. I will say that I've known budgets, I've dealt with budgets over time. I've looked at the history of the University of Colorado budget, but I'm not a university budget expert. And so maybe that shows in not knowing that there were other institutions that at least attempted to do a cohort based on their family income, not, I think that's the more common, and I've never seen it written up, but I'll take a look at that some more. The more common is that there are differential rates between the majors, but they used to talk about that as a kind of a panacea, and Michigan was one of the early ones I know that did that. But they're always marginal. They're not like thousands and thousands of dollars difference normally. That at least as far as last time I looked, it's been some time. So George, you want me to keep going?
Yeah, I think. Yeah,
Yep.
Please do.
Okay, so I did. If you had a chance, I did a little summary before the attempted coup about what Biden's campaign plan had said they were looking to do. But I think most of these seem to be on the plate after his inauguration and with his new Secretary of Education. One is to double the Pell Grant amount from 6,000 to 12,000, and we've been stuck at the same amount for a very, very long time. It hasn't been has been tagged to inflation. Republicans have generally been very opposed to any change in increasing the Pell Grant, but this would be a very significant increase. It really depends on where you go to college. A community college versus where students are eligible for Pell Grants versus, obviously a high cost private institution. What does 12K get you? Well, it still gets you something in combination with other financial aid. But, generally tuition, I think on the average for four-year public institutions is close to 8 or 10K. So anyway, that gives you a kind of a sense of the potential impact. And you see still at about 14K at the undergraduate level, varies by campus. So that would be a big deal. And that gets back to the finances and the variables that we looked at. Should the University of California, for example, just to be a little bit edgy, maybe it should rethink its 33%. How does that relate to the student demographics? What is the best way for tuition versus, and this is the other aspect too, actually, is that how much is related in your financial aid towards tuition specifically versus overall your living costs, which are obviously huge and a big component actually of debt relief, but or student debt. Obviously, like the Obama administration, much more to come for community colleges and subsidizations in that area. And here are the two questions I'm going to come back to you, our Gardner Fellows. Free tuition for students and families who make under 125K. Okay, that's different than Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who wanted free tuition, public university college tuition for everybody, okay? And Biden is looking for a more targeted amount. Now, also, as I discussed in that blog that I wrote about Biden's policies, is the politics of this are very substantial to get anything like this through. In this particular case, it can't be done by executive order. It's a budget issue that has to go through Congress. And I think this just adds a lot of complexity, but we'll come back to that. The other is student debt relief from 10K, not the 50K that currently some of the Democratic leadership is asking for. And it's a targeted, at least in his original campaign, it was a very targeted 10K for people that are in public service or other things. But now I believe it is expanded to just a general blanket 10K. And the thing about that that's interesting, which I didn't realize until more recently, is that Biden could technically do that under an executive order because he has some provisions related to debt relief that instead of going to Congress and asking for the money and all of that and legislation to do it, he could just simply do it. But there's a big cost to that as well. So, but I want to come back to those two issues because there are some interesting things about those things and what are we trying to do in tuition and debt relief. Visa reform, significant changes almost immediately tomorrow. There are restrictions on year-long visas for international students at the graduate level and all kinds of things related to China. The Muslim ban as well will be lifted, which has an impact on students. DACA, he will reinvent. DACA was always an executive order with lots of things going on in the courts. And there is what money in the higher ed community, the lobbying group in DuPont Circle and others, DuPont Circle in DC, which is where all of these associations related to higher ed are. I think it's inadequate, but there will be $35 billion to help colleges and universities. But the other part that's in this that, as I discussed in this little blog thing, is that one of the biggest variables is whether the states are going to be and local governments are going to get some kind of bailout out of. They didn't get it out of the last smaller relief package that came out of the McConnell Senate. And if that occurs, that can be a very significant component of California's and other states' financial picture. Although there's a really strange thing about California's financial picture, which will be part of we'll talk about the governor's budget and the oddness of California's fiscal position. But what I wanted to say was, I think that's a kind of a decent summary of the Biden higher ed policies, which will be welcomed and very different beyond just being more open to international engagement, research to students and talent, which is really important for us and for California, but for all the United States. But here's the questions I wanted to ask before we talk a little bit about the governor's budget. And I know there's not a lot of time, but okay, so what's the kind of thinking among among all of you? Whether we should be having tuition should be free at public universities. Is there a sense that this is something we should do or not at the federal government? And then I want to just add a couple of things there to the discussion before you voice an opinion, any of you who would like. And that is that most no, I think I'll just leave it as it is. We'll just leave it as it is. Then the other would be should all past students get a $50,000 relief in their debt relief, student debt relief. So the first question: should tuition be free? What do you see as the good thing or bad thing about that at the federal level? So I open that up. Anyone want to make a comment? How about Jazz? Since I've been talking to you, Jazz, you have an opinion on this, I'm sure.
I had a feeling that I was going to get put on the spot by you. I mean, the question of should, I don't know if I have a clear answer on that, but even taking it on a more microscopic level on just the UC system, like I've always been frustrated by, even at the Regents table, sort of the unwillingness to have, I think, the philosophical conversation on what pricing should look like. So whether the university should be going for a quote unquote low sticker price as opposed to a more targeted subsidy model. And I think there are philosophical considerations that our leaders at that table aren't giving the time to think about. And really what we have right now, even just for the UC system, is something that's trying to have it both ways. And we're seeing the tensions of that. And I think to your earlier presentation, that's part of the crux of this tipping point or existential crisis. And you know, I would say that's why on the federal level, you know, I think it's a bit ironic that some of the more progressive folks and quote unquote progressive calls for free tuition to everybody actually might far provide more benefits to the wealthy in this country as opposed to those at the bottom. So I think noting those ironies, that's what I see the most from like things like this.
You know, one other thing that relates to that is that the deal is it's not just that the federal government's going to provide enough money to states who charge different variations of tuition. Already it adds a lot of complexity, but that states have to chip in. And if I remember, it's something like 25% of the cost. So we get back down to what money does states have and where is the priority for them? And it wouldn't be a mandate. It would be states would be agreed to take that on and then and put in the more money. Now, I mean, there's some good things about that, but I think what you just said from my viewpoint too is it's not a targeted way of approaching income inequality, which is a gigantic problem in our country. And can't we be a little bit smarter about this in some way? But I'd like to hear other arguments because there are other ways of looking at it. Is there somebody else who'd like to comment?
I guess I could jump in. So on personal opinion, my answer would be yes. If I were to give a more measured sort of policy opinion, one could argue with the similar reasoning that we have that made K through 12 free, that the equivalent today, I think, is around a 2-year college, is around 2 years of college. So by the same line of reasoning, if we're making it equivalent to how they made decisions in the past, I don't see any reason why at least the government shouldn't subsidize up to 2 years of college for everyone. And then definitely support families that make under 125K. So as part of like upward mobility, colleges play a huge part, and the costs in America are extremely, let's say, a huge barrier. So there's a huge argument to be made there for the 125K. And I guess it also touches a bit on the student debt relief. I think the only argument I've heard against it, especially, might be that it ends up being a bit of a regressive tax almost, and that it's going to disproportionately benefit wealthier people who attended college and took on those loans. But to stay on topic with free tuition, like I think there's a very strong argument to be made for at least 2 free years if we're just extrapolating from what K through 12 used to be before and what it's worth now, and its equivalent is at least some measure of college education,
Yeah, I think in the paper, the blog I did, I went, looked at what people said it would cost. Now the 125K is, I can't remember what that cost is, but the free tuition cost was supposed to be something in the range of like 55 billion a year, according to the one estimate. I guess it depends on how many states do it and all of that kind of thing from the federal government. Then there would be the additional amount that the states would have to come. So it gets to be something like in the range for the federal government, like $700 billion over 10 years or something like that, which doesn't, when you look at the cost of an aircraft carrier, I mean, and the Defense Department, maybe not. But I think the politics are just very difficult to have such a broad scope. And I do think it's interesting that so many progressives, of the ilk of the Bernie Sanders, it's kind of a shotgun approach. It's not a targeted attempt. And I think it relates because it does sound good. But, and it does hark back to our earlier promises for higher ed that they were tuition. But what I've argued in the past is that if you look at, well, where are the societies that have free tuition and where you can argue it also makes sense. And I'll tell you where they are. They tend to be in Northern Europe and where societies are much more equitable. There's not the kind of significant income inequality that we have in the United States. I mean, we have, and it's just getting worse. I mean, we have really big problems from this. So it kind of makes sense in a more equitable society. But then if you're doing it in a place where there's so much inequity, it just seems like a gigantic giveaway. And you have to think about the cost of that giveaway, not just for that one program, but all the other kind of liberal causes or progressive causes you care about. And I liked what Jim Clybourne said. I don't know, although he's been for the 50K debt relief program, because they are kind of linked here, but he said, we don't want it to be free. When Biden was running in South Carolina, right? South Carolina, he said, the message is from Democrats is, we don't want everything to be free. What we wanted is to be affordable and accessible. And that is such a great, to me, a persuasive line. So then how do you get to, so anyway, a couple other, one maybe or two other, any comments about tuition free and how you feel about it?
I have a comment about that in terms of tuition free. I think just agreeing with what Antoine said about how making it free for those who make under 125K would really help with the issues with income inequality that you were mentioning. And along the lines of the quote about making it affordable and accessible, I guess that does make it affordable and accessible because those who make above that can still afford and access college without the free tuition. And then I had a question for Antoine. When you mentioned the 2-year college should be free, do you mean community colleges or 2 years of a 4-year college or any 2 years of higher education? I'm just curious about that.
So I think there's an argument to be made for both. And a lot of the times now, like community colleges are being used as like, at least for UCSB, we have them from, what's it called, SBCC. People would do 2 years in SBCC and try to get the transfer into UCSB. So like those community colleges are also being used as sort of a stepping stone into universities, and you end up paying much less over those first 2 years. So I think even funding even if we're just doing community college, I think it's a huge step forward already.
Okay, so sorry, does somebody else have a quick comment? Because we've got 10 minutes left and I want to get to the budget issues too, but something else about student debt or tuition free? I would only say about, the 10K more directed financial aid, does it get same kind of issues of equity or where are we targeting our money? If you know about student debt, about half of student debt is at the graduate level, right? So these are people who are making choices to go into professional schools. I should say, I think it's graduate level and for-profits. So for-profits are a huge component of this, the abuse of that side of the market. Not all for-profits are bad, but a lot of them have very shady business models. And so student debt is, more complicated. And like people like Sandy Baum, who is given a talk at the center, who's a well-known higher ed finance person, they argue that it's better, to target these kinds of programs than to just give out blanket amounts of money to people like, say, an upper income person who's making. Sorry, go ahead. What was that?
Physicist on the radio. Yeah. And she says, well, the state makes the rules. And she said, obviously, somebody who's a healthy 65-year-old and somebody who is 64 and some months with multiple issues should be ahead of the healthy 65-year-old. I mean, that's what I'm asking. I think I will just go.
Was that a question? I wasn't quite sure. Okay, with the time remaining, let's quickly go into the California budget issue and get George to comment on it a little bit. And that is, okay, so the weird thing about California is that while there were earlier projections of substantial financial deficits, operating deficits for the state of California, because our tax system is so reliant on capital gains, on income taxes, the net effect is this odd, weird world we're in which we have this financial collapse and COVID, is that the stock market keeps going up. And rich people have a lot of money in the stock market. And so they've actually made a lot of money. and they're making trades, and they therefore have much larger capital gains. The net result is that the state of California is ending up, after projecting a significant deficit maybe 6 months ago, is ending up with a $15.5 billion surplus going into this year, which is a major shift. So the next thing you know, the governor comes out a week ago, roughly, and says how he's going to spend that money. And this is how he said he's going to allocate most of it to one-time spending, very little on ongoing. Part of it, that SFEU balance is our rainy day fund. So we've already been delving into that. That's a fund setup just in case things go really bad, in order to try to level out spending in bad years. And so he's putting back some of that money. And as you can see on higher ed, there's some money going to higher ed, almost all of it's one time. And I don't want to get, that's a little too complicated to get into it, but you see in CSU will get a very small bump in their operating budget. The rest goes to very specific kind of needs. George, do you want to make any comments about the adequacy of the governor's budgets, or your opinion about it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the governor's budget, I forget the exact dollar amount, but it represents, in terms of ongoing budget for UC, a 3.9% increase in the state support for UC. And at first glance, if you don't think about it, that sounds pretty good, almost a 4% increase. But if you think about it a little bit more carefully, you realize that it isn't such a good thing, because he's also requiring that the university keep tuition constant. Currently, in terms of the educational budget of UC, that is the part of core funding that funds student education, roughly 40% of the funding for that comes from the state and 60% comes from tuition. I mean, I just want to emphasize to you that we've gone from, in the early years of the master plan, we were a state-supported institution. And then the university started charging more and more tuition. And so we went from state-supported to only partially state-supported. And then, as John pointed out, sometime around 2010, the university started collecting more money in tuition than we get from state support. So therefore, we became a tuition-supported educational institution with only augmentation. So we are now a state-augmented institution. Today, we are at 60% funding from tuition and 40% from the state. And of course, my fear is that we'll become, sometime in the future, a state-tolerated institution. But leaving that aside, think about the 60-40 ratio. If the governor gives us a 4% increase on 40% of our budget, that corresponds to roughly a net 1.5% increase in the total budget. And a 1.5% increase may sound okay, but if you look at the costs that the university has, costs in pension, costs in union contracts, costs in faculty salaries, the cost that the university pays goes up between 4 and 5% a year. So basically, this governor's budget proposes what is effectively a 1.5% increase in revenue for education and roughly a 5% increase in cost for education. So the net effect is a decrease in the spending power of UC. Another way to say it is, if you compare this year's budget from the governor to not last year's, because last year's was all affected by COVID and all that stuff, but compare it to the year before we ever heard of COVID-19. In fact, the proposal from Governor Newsom for next year's budget is less than we were getting 2 years ago. So it's less in terms of total dollars, and yet the university has had to deal with essentially 5% increases in costs. So there's a fundamental net decrease in buying power from the governor's budget in terms of what his proposal is. Last comment: if you read the newspapers and you read the comments from the leaders of the three systems of higher education, if you read them carefully, they do thank the governor for providing more money for UC. And they're very nice in thanking the governor, but they're not exactly profuse in praise for the governor's budget. If you read the LA Times article, you'll notice I have a comment in there that's much more negative. than that of the leaders of the three systems. And my more negative comment was based upon just what I said, the feeling that this just continues the economic degradation of funding for the university. So I guess that's my comment. It's not a particularly good governor's budget, and it could have been worse. It could be that if the state were in terrible financial shape, he might have even cut money from the university. But it isn't certainly something that we would celebrate.
Yeah, I think what I would say too, though, is that this is kind of the current reality, or it's been the reality for some time, that governors don't really see significant benefit politically to doing anything too significant in higher ed beyond keeping tuition steady. They see the political benefit of that. But they also have to, beyond being political animals, they have a lot of competing things they need to fund and deal with. And so I guess that gets back to the message a little bit that I just don't really see a scenario of a significant change in the state's position and funding for UC in, at the interim, I don't know, 5-8 years more. And that comes back to what is UC going to do? Can it continue to diversify? Can there be more funding from the federal government in some form that might change the equation some? Do we need to reduce our costs in order to maintain, or as I said, the tipping point? Should we, consider at some point, which is easy to say and almost impossible to do, to say we're not going to grow anymore. We're at a tipping point. We just have to, or we're not going to grow at the same rate, and we're going to redefine our admissions pool. But I don't know, George, do you feel that that is a point that we might get to in a reasonable period of time, or do you feel that we can always just kind of manage and make our way through it?
Well, I'm more radical on this. I mean, I have advocated for several years now that we use enrollment as one of the variables that we can control as a university. And I will tell you that at least a couple of other chancellors agree with me about that. On the other hand, the university leadership, basically the president's office, has not been willing to go down that path. It is a radical path, and it is one that will cause considerable dissension. But to me, the issue is, are we going to maintain the quality of the university? It troubles me deeply that, like, if you go back, decades to when I was a student, we had a university that was mostly upper class, socioeconomic backgrounds. We had a university that was very white, and we provided substantial funding to the university to provide education for our students. Today, when we have a much more diverse university and a much greater diversity in terms of socioeconomic status, this is the time when we choose to defund the university in terms of providing that educational opportunity. And that seems to me fundamentally unfair. So from my perspective, the university needs to take a more proactive role, and enrollment is a variable that we can control.
Yep, I think that was at least some of our messaging in that report. I will just say my final comment is that I would assume that some of you are interested in becoming academics or perhaps policy research people. And so the question comes, well, when you do something like this, what kind of impact does it have on actual policy? And I just tell you, I knew from the beginning, because I've been, as I said earlier, that it's really tough to move the ship, the tanker that's going down the line. And, there's so many competing people with ideas or more political influence and power. And I would say, like this paper or this report, it may have edified a few people out there, or many people know, like a person like George, he knows a lot of this stuff. He doesn't need me to write it out that much. But it's really hard to really influence policy. But I would still say that I hope you all think that way in your research or scholarly work, depending on what you're doing, but that you're thinking about how your research can inform policymakers, even though if I tell you a story of minimal impact and lots of work. All right, so I don't, George, you have any last comment? And then we'll.
My last comment is, John, I think you're right, but I also think you had more influence than you think. This paper was, I went to a retreat of all the UC regents and the chancellors, And this paper was distributed to everyone before they came to the retreat as kind of one of the reading materials for the retreat. My sense is that all of the chancellors read it, and probably very few of the regents. But I think it did have an impact, and I think I'm really glad that you did it. So I think it's worth it is worth doing this kind of report, and I'm really glad that all of the students in the seminar today had an opportunity to see an example of the kind of report that's intended to influence public policy. So I'm a little bit more upbeat in terms of what it has done and what it might still continue to do.
Okay, well, thank you. That was very generous of you. So, okay. All right, so I think, George, we're done, or what's the?
I think we're done, and thank you all, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.